The rain hammered against the tinted windows of the black SUV as it rolled through the gates of Camp Pendleton just after midnight. Inside, Lieutenant Commander Victoria Hale sat perfectly still, her gray eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. She wore civilian clothes, jeans and a worn leather jacket that had seen deployers from the Hindu Kush to the Horn of Africa. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, no jewelry except for a single silver ring on her right hand that caught the passing streetlights. The driver, a young Navy ensign who'd picked her up from Miramar, kept glancing in the rearview mirror like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Victoria didn't help him. She'd learned long ago that silence was its own form of protection, especially when you were about to walk into a room full of people who thought they knew exactly who you were and what you were worth. The SUV pulled up to the operations center, a low concrete building that looked like every other military structure she'd seen in 15 years of service. She stepped out into the rain without waiting for the ensign to open her door, her boots hitting the wet pavement with a quiet splash. Two Marines stood guard at the entrance, their rifles held at port arms, rain streaming off their helmets. The younger one, a lance corporal with acne scars still visible on his jaw, stepped forward as she approached. His hand came up, palm out, the universal gesture for stop. Victoria paused, rain soaking through her jacket, and waited. The Marine's eyes traveled over her civilian clothes, her unassuming appearance, the complete absence of anything that screamed military authority. His lip curled slightly, that particular expression of dismissal she'd seen 1,000 times before. "Not today, lady. Not here. Not now." "Ma'am, this is a restricted area," he said, his voice carrying that edge of performative authority young enlisted men sometimes used when they thought they'd caught someone out of bounds. "You're going to need to turn around and head back to the visitor's center. Someone there can help you find whatever lost spouse or dependent you're looking for." Behind him, the other Marine, a corporal with more time in grade, shifted his weight uncomfortably. Something in Victoria's stillness seemed to register with him, some quality he couldn't quite name but recognized instinctively. Victoria didn't move. She stood in the rain, water running down her face, and let the silence stretch out between them. The lance corporal's hand moved closer to her shoulder, not quite touching but making his intention clear. He was going to physically turn her around if she didn't comply. His fingers were inches from her jacket when the door behind him slammed open and a Navy captain emerged, his face flushed with something between anger and embarrassment. "Lance Corporal Morrison," the captain's voice cut through the rain like a blade, "step away from the lieutenant commander. Right now." The young Marine's face went from confident to confused to pale in the space of 3 seconds. Morrison's hand froze in midair, his fingers still extended toward Victoria's shoulder but no longer moving. The rain continued its relentless drumming on the concrete, on helmets, on the roof of the ops center behind them. Victoria still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything except stand there with that same calm, patient expression that had unnerved insurgent commanders and allied generals alike. The captain, whose name tape read BRENNAN, stepped fully out into the rain, letting the door swing shut behind him. He was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from too many deployments in too many desert climates. His eyes, when they met Victoria's, held something complicated respect, certainly, but also a kind of weary acknowledgement of what was about to happen. "Do you have any idea who you just tried to manhandle, Marine?" Captain Brennan's voice was quiet now, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been shouting. Morrison's hand dropped to his side. His face had gone from pale to ashen. "Sir, she wasn't in uniform, sir. No identification visible. Protocol states," Brennan interrupted, "that when a vehicle with a command pennant arrives at this facility after midnight, you check the manifest and you sure as hell don't put your hands on anyone until you know who they are." He turned to Victoria and his posture changed subtly, shifting into something closer to attention. "Commander Hale, my apologies. These men weren't briefed on your arrival." Victoria finally moved, a slight tilt of her head that acknowledged the apology without quite accepting it. When she spoke, her voice was low and carried a trace of something that might have been Kentucky or Tennessee, softened by years of living everywhere else. "Captain, it's fine. The Lance Corporal was doing his job." She turned her gray eyes to Morrison, who looked like he wanted the concrete beneath his boots to open up and swallow him whole. "You stopped an unidentified civilian from entering a restricted military facility in the middle of the night. That's exactly what you should have done." But Morrison wasn't stupid, and he could hear what she wasn't saying, that there were ways to stop someone that didn't involve contempt, didn't involve assumptions about lost spouses and dependent services. His jaw tightened, and Victoria saw the moment he understood the full scope of his mistake. Not just that he'd been wrong about her rank, but about everything he'd assumed in that first 3-second assessment. Brennan gestured toward the door. "Commander, if you'll follow me. The briefing team's been waiting." Victoria moved forward, and the two Marines stepped aside with a precision that bordered on desperate. As she passed Morrison, she paused for just a fraction of a second. "What's your first name, Lance Corporal?" Morrison blinked, caught off guard. "Jacob, ma'am. Jacob Morrison." She said it like she was filing it away, committing it to memory. "You've got good instincts. Work on your assessment skills." Then she was past him, following Brennan into the building, leaving Morrison and the corporal standing in the rain. The corporal, whose name tape read HAYS, let out a long breath once the door closed. "Jesus Christ, Morrison. Do you have any idea who that was?" Morrison shook his head, still staring at the closed door, rain streaming down his face. "Obviously not." Hayes pulled out his phone, shielding it from the rain, and pulled up something that made the screen glow blue-white in the darkness. He turned it so Morrison could see. It was a news article, dated 3 years earlier, with a photo that Morrison recognized immediately despite the different context. Same woman, same gray eyes, but in the photo she was in full combat gear, standing in front of a burned-out compound somewhere that looked like Afghanistan or Iraq. The headline read, "Navy SEAL Support Commander Victoria Hale leads Joint Strike Team in Successful Hostage Rescue Operation." Morrison felt his stomach drop. "She's a SEAL commander." Hayes shook his head slowly. "Not exactly. SEALs don't let women into their teams, not officially. But Commander Hale, she's the one who gets called when SEAL Team 6 needs someone to coordinate air support, intelligence, and extraction for operations they can't fuck up. She's flown missions with Delta, with DEVGRU, with units that don't have names. She's got more combat hours than most fighter pilots and more classified commendations than you've had hot meals." He pocketed his phone. "And you just tried to physically remove her from a facility she probably has higher clearance for than anyone else in that building." Morrison closed his eyes. "I'm fucked." "Probably," Hayes agreed. "But she told you that you have good instincts, so maybe not completely fucked." Inside the operations center, Victoria followed Captain Brennan through a maze of corridors that all looked identical: fluorescent lights, beige walls, linoleum floors polished to a dull shine. They passed offices where staff officers worked late into the night, their faces illuminated by computer screens showing satellite imagery and intelligence reports. A few looked up as Victoria passed, and she saw the same pattern repeat itself: initial dismissal of the woman in civilian clothes, then recognition, then something that looked almost like relief. Brennan finally stopped at a conference room at the end of the hall. Through the small window in the door, Victoria could see at least a dozen people gathered around a long table covered in maps and photographs. "They're ready for you," Brennan said. "The situation's evolved since we sent the initial request for your presence. It's worse than we thought." Victoria's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a kind of settling into readiness that was visible only if you knew what to look for. "How much worse?" Brennan pulled out a tablet and brought up a satellite image, timestamp showing it was less than 6 hours old. The image showed a compound in what looked like mountainous terrain, somewhere with pine forests and rocky outcroppings. But it was the cluster of vehicles around the compound that made Victoria's jaw tight, almost imperceptibly: 3 technical trucks with mounted weapons, 2 armored personnel carriers that looked Russian in origin, and what appeared to be a mobile SAM launcher. The hostages are 3 Marine Force recon operators who were running a training mission with local allied forces in a country I can't name because we're not supposed to have people there. They got compromised, ambushed, and now they're being held by a mercenary group with connections to Russian military intelligence. The group calls themselves Crimson Shield. Ever heard of them? Victoria had. Crimson Shield was one of the newer private military corporations operating in gray zones around the world, officially Russian, but with enough plausible deniability that Moscow could disavow them when convenient. They'd been involved in conflicts from Syria to the Central African Republic, and they had a reputation for professionalism that made them significantly more dangerous than typical militants. "What's the time frame?" Victoria asked. 72 hours. After that, Crimson Shield moves the hostages to a secondary location we haven't identified yet. Once they're moved, the window for any kind of rescue operation closes, and the political situation— Brennan trailed off, but Victoria understood. Officially sanctioned military operations in countries where America wasn't supposed to have boots on the ground were complicated at the best of times. A rescue mission that went wrong could spark an international incident, damage relationships with allies, and expose operations that were supposed to remain buried. "You want me to plan and coordinate an extraction," Victoria said. It wasn't a question. Brennan met her eyes. "I want you to do what you do, Commander. I want you to bring our people home." Victoria nodded once, then pushed open the conference room door. The conversation inside died immediately as a dozen faces turned toward her Marine colonels, Navy commanders, Air Force majors, and a couple of civilians who were almost certainly CIA. The civilian clothes, the wet hair, the complete absence of rank insignia. For the second time that night, Victoria watched people assess her and find her wanting. A Marine colonel at the head of the table, a man with a chest full of ribbons and the kind of bearing that suggested he'd spent his entire career being the smartest guy in every room, frowned. "Captain Brennan, I thought you were bringing the SEAL liaison." "I did, sir," Brennan said quietly. "This is Lieutenant Commander Victoria Hale." The silence that followed was heavy enough to have weight. The Marine colonel's frown deepened. He looked at Victoria the way Morrison had looked at her outside with skepticism barely masked by military courtesy. "Commander Hale, I was expecting someone from the SEAL community." Translation: I was expecting a man. Victoria had heard the unspoken words enough times that they'd stopped having any emotional impact years ago. She moved to the table, her wet boots leaving faint marks on the polished floor, and looked down at the maps and photographs spread across the surface. She studied them in silence for perhaps 20 seconds while everyone in the room watched her, waiting for something. A response to the colonel's implied dismissal, an assertion of authority, anything that would help them categorize her and decide how seriously to take her. Instead, she reached out and tapped one of the photographs, a long-range shot of the compound. "This image is 6 hours old. Do we have anything more recent?" An Air Force major, a woman with captain's bars who looked relieved to have something concrete to respond to, nodded and pulled up a fresh image on the large screen at the end of the room. "This came in 90 minutes ago from a surveillance drone we repositioned after the initial request went up the chain." Victoria studied the new image. The vehicles were in slightly different positions, and there were more people visible around the compound guards in tactical gear, weapons clearly visible. "How many hostiles are we looking at?" "Best estimate is between 20 and 30, one of the CIA officers said, a man in his 40s with the kind of tan that suggested he spent more time in field stations than at Langley. Crimson Shield typically operates in small, highly trained units. These aren't conscripts or militia. They're professional soldiers, former Russian Spetsnaz, former GRU, that caliber." Victoria pulled out a chair and sat down, ignoring the way the Marine colonel's eyes narrowed at her presumption. She wasn't waiting to be invited anymore. That phase of the evening was over. "Tell me about the compound's defenses," she said, her voice still quiet but now carrying an edge of command that made several people around the table straighten unconsciously. "Perimeter security, fields of fire, approaches that offer concealment. The Air Force major brought up a tactical overlay, and for the next 15 minutes, the room transformed into what it was supposed to be, a professional military planning session focused on solving an extremely difficult problem. Victoria asked questions that demonstrated an intimate understanding of close air support, helicopter insertion protocols, and the specific vulnerabilities of compounds in mountainous terrain. She identified problems with the initial rescue concepts that the planning team had developed, pointing out issues with timing, with coordination between air and ground elements, with assumptions about enemy response patterns. The Marine colonel, whose name she learned was Harrison, watched this with an expression that slowly shifted from skeptical to something more complicated. When Victoria finished her initial assessment of the situation and looked up from the maps, Harrison leaned back in his chair. "Commander Hale, your reputation precedes you. I've read the after-action reports from Operation Serpent Wind and the Kandahar extraction. Impressive work." There was still something grudging in his tone, like he was offering praise he didn't quite want to give. Victoria didn't react. "Thank you, sir, but reputations don't bring people home. Planning and execution do." "Agreed." Harrison gestured to the maps. "The planning team has developed 3 potential courses of action. I'd like your assessment of each before we brief the flag officers." Victoria spent the next hour dissecting each proposed plan, identifying strengths and weaknesses with a precision that left no room for ego or politics. The first plan relied too heavily on helicopter insertion, without adequate suppression of the mobile SAM launcher. The second plan had good bones, but assumed a level of surprise they were unlikely to achieve given Crimson Shield's professional security protocols. The third plan was overly cautious, with so many contingencies and fallback positions that it would take too long to execute and give the enemy time to move the hostages. By the time she finished, it was nearly 2 in the morning, and the energy in the room had shifted completely. The people around the table were no longer assessing whether Victoria belonged there. They were waiting for her to tell them what would actually work. Captain Brennan, who'd been mostly silent during the briefing, finally spoke up. "Commander, you've identified problems with all 3 courses of action. What's your recommendation?" Victoria stood and moved to the large tactical map on the wall, studying the terrain around the target compound. When she turned back to face the room, there was something different in her posture, a kind of coiled intensity that suggested she'd moved from analysis mode into operational planning mode. "We need to think about this differently," she said. "Crimson Shield is expecting either a ground assault or nothing. They're professional enough to have planned for a conventional rescue attempt. So we give them something they're not expecting, a deception operation that makes them believe we're coming from one direction, while the actual rescue team approaches from another." She moved back to the table and began sketching on a transparent overlay laid across the satellite image. "Here's what I'm thinking. We create a diversionary probe from the east, using a small team with significant air support, enough noise and apparent force to convince Crimson Shield that it's the main assault. While they're repositioning to counter that threat, we insert the actual rescue team from the north via fast-rope insertion from helicopters flying nap of the earth through this valley." She traced a route with her finger. "The northern approach has better concealment from the SAM launcher because of this ridgeline, and the terrain funnels down to within 200 meters of the compound. Fast insertion, hard breach, extract the hostages, and we're gone before Crimson Shield fully realizes what happened." The room was silent. One of the Marine majors leaned forward, studying the route Victoria had outlined. "That valley is narrow as hell, Commander. We'd be threading a needle with helicopters in the dark. If we take fire or if weather moves in, then we need pilots who can fly that valley in the dark, in weather, under fire," Victoria said simply. "And we need the diversion to be convincing enough that Crimson Shield commits their forces to the wrong side of the compound." Harrison's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The diversionary team would be taking significant risk. They'd be drawing fire from a professional military force with prepared positions and heavy weapons. We'd need someone coordinating that element who can manage close air support, control the tempo of the engagement, and pull out before it turns into a sustained firefight we can't win. Victoria met his gaze steadily. Yes, sir, we would. There was a long pause while Harrison processed what she wasn't saying directly, that she intended to be the one coordinating that diversionary element, putting herself in harm's way to make the deception work. The CIA officer who'd spoken earlier cleared his throat. Commander Hale, with all due respect, you're one of the most experienced tactical coordinators we have for this kind of operation. Putting you on the ground in the diversionary element seems like an unnecessary risk. We could have you coordinate from a TOC, safe and able to manage the entire operation. Victoria shook her head slowly. The diversionary probe only works if it's convincing. That means real-time decisions about when to press, when to hold, when to make it look like we're taking casualties and falling back. Those decisions need to happen at the speed of combat, not through a radio relay to a tactical operations center 50 miles away. I need to be there. The Air Force major spoke up, her voice careful. And if something goes wrong, if Crimson Shield doesn't take the bait or if they split their forces, then I adapt, Victoria said simply. That's what I do. Harrison studied her for a long moment, and Victoria could see him weighing options, calculating risks, trying to decide if this relatively quiet woman in wet civilian clothes could actually pull off what she was describing. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right, Commander, develop the full operational plan. I want it on my desk by 0600, complete with contingencies, required assets, and timeline. If it holds up under scrutiny, we'll brief it to the Admiral and see if we can get approval to execute. Yes, sir, Victoria said. As the meeting broke up, people began filing out of the conference room, most of them heading for coffee or a few hours of sleep before the next round of planning began. Captain Brennan lingered, waiting until most of the others had left before approaching Victoria. You know what you're volunteering for, right? He asked quietly. You'd be going into a hot zone against professional soldiers who know exactly what they're doing. The diversionary team might only be 4 or 5 operators. If Crimson Shield decides to overwhelm that position instead of just defending against it. I know, Victoria said. She was gathering up the maps and photographs, organizing them with practiced efficiency. But it's the best chance we have of getting our people out alive, and I've been in tight spots before. Brennan nodded, but he didn't look entirely convinced. I read your file before requesting your presence. Operation Serpent Wind, the Kandahar extraction, the mission in Somalia that's still classified. You've got a track record that speaks for itself. But you've also got a pattern of putting yourself in the most dangerous position in any operation you plan. Eventually, that catches up with people. Victoria looked up from the maps, and for the first time that night, something that might have been a smile touched the corners of her mouth. It wasn't a happy expression. Captain, I've been catching up with that pattern for 15 years. So far, I'm still faster than it is. She picked up the stack of materials and headed for the door, then paused and looked back. The Lance Corporal outside, Morrison. He made a mistake tonight, but he was doing his job. Make sure that goes in his record, that he stopped an unidentified person from accessing a restricted facility, exactly as he should have. Brennan raised an eyebrow. You're protecting the kid who tried to physically turn you away. I'm acknowledging that he did what he was trained to do, Victoria corrected. What happened after that is on me for not presenting credentials immediately. He doesn't need his career damaged because I chose to make a point about assumptions. She left before Brennan could respond, moving through the corridors of the operations center with the maps tucked under one arm. She found an empty office, appropriated it without asking permission, and spent the next 4 hours building the operational plan in exhaustive detail. The sun was just beginning to lighten the sky outside when she finally sat back and reviewed what she'd created. It was aggressive, risky, and required perfect timing across multiple elements. It was also, she believed, the best chance those 3 Marines had of coming home alive. She sent the completed plan to Harrison's secure email, then allowed herself exactly 30 minutes of rest, not sleep. Just rest, sitting in the office chair with her eyes closed and her breathing slowed. At 5:30, her internal clock brought her back to full alertness. She stood, stretched muscles that had been still too long, and went to find coffee. The operations center's small galley was nearly empty at this hour, just a couple of night shift watchstanders refilling their mugs before heading off duty. Victoria poured herself a cup of black coffee and was turning to leave when she found Lance Corporal Morrison standing in the doorway. He looked like he hadn't slept, his uniform slightly rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed. When he saw Victoria, he came to attention with a precision that bordered on desperate. "Ma'am," Victoria held up one hand, cutting him off. "At ease, Lance Corporal. It's too early for formality and I haven't had enough coffee yet for apologies." Morrison relaxed fractionally, but his face was still tight with anxiety. "I wanted to explain, ma'am. I didn't know who you were and I made assumptions based on my appearance," Victoria finished for him. "On the fact that I'm a woman in civilian clothes showing up at a military facility in the middle of the night. I understand, Morrison. I've been making that calculation for most of my career, how much energy to spend correcting assumptions versus just getting the job done." She took a sip of coffee, studying him over the rim of the cup. "You want to know why I'm not angry?" Morrison nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Because anger would require me to be surprised," Victoria said. "And I stopped being surprised by that particular reaction a long time ago. The question isn't whether people underestimate me initially, they almost always do. The question is what they do after they realize they were wrong. Some people double down, get defensive, try to justify their initial assessment. Other people learn from it and become better at their jobs. Which kind of person are you, Lance Corporal?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "The second kind, ma'am, I hope." "Good." Victoria moved toward the door, then paused beside him. "There's a lesson in what happened last night, Morrison, and it's not the one you think. The lesson isn't don't judge people by their appearance. That's too simple and not particularly useful in a combat environment where quick assessments can save lives." She met his eyes directly, and Morrison found himself unable to look away. "The real lesson is this. When your initial assessment turns out to be wrong, how quickly can you adapt? How fast can you shift from what you thought you knew to what's actually in front of you? That's the skill that keeps you alive in combat. That's the skill that makes you someone your teammates can trust. Work on that." Then she was gone, leaving Morrison standing in the empty galley with the morning light growing stronger outside and the weight of her words settling into his understanding of what had happened. By 0600, Victoria was back in the conference room, now crowded with even more people than the night before. An admiral had arrived, a two-star named Patterson who had a reputation for being both brilliant and difficult. He'd spent 30 minutes grilling Victoria on every aspect of the operational plan, looking for weaknesses, testing her assumptions, pushing back on the risks involved in the diversionary element. Victoria had answered every question with the same quiet precision, neither defensive nor aggressive, just presenting facts and professional military judgment. Finally, Patterson had leaned back and looked at Harrison. "Colonel, this is either going to work brilliantly or it's going to be a complete disaster. There's not much middle ground." "No, sir," Harrison agreed, "but I believe Commander Hale's plan gives us the best odds of success, and the clock is ticking. We're down to 65 hours before Crimson Shield moves the hostages." Patterson turned his attention back to Victoria. "Commander, I'm going to approve this operation with one modification. I want you coordinating from the Tactical Operations Center, not on the ground with the diversionary element. We can't afford to lose someone with your experience and skill set because of an unnecessary risk." Victoria had been expecting this. "Sir, with respect, the modification you're suggesting fundamentally changes the nature of the operation. The diversionary probe only works if it's responsive enough to keep Crimson Shield committed. That requires someone on the ground making real-time decisions about the tempo and character of the engagement. Radio lag and reduced situational awareness from a TOC will compromise that responsiveness." "Then we put someone else on the ground with the diversion," Patterson said. "A forward air controller, a JTAC, someone qualified to coordinate but not someone we can't afford to lose." Victoria chose her next words carefully. "Admiral, I understand your concern, But this operation succeeds or fails based on whether we can convince professional soldiers that they're facing a significant assault from the east while the real rescue team approaches from the north. That deception requires not just tactical competence, but an understanding of how Crimson Shield thinks, how they'll respond, what indicators they'll be looking for to determine if the Eastern assault is real or a feint. I've spent 15 years studying how professional military forces respond to asymmetric threats. I've run operations against Russian-trained units in Syria and Ukrainian separatists in the Donbass. I know how they think. She paused, letting that sink in. You can replace me with a qualified JTAC, sir, and they'll do their job competently. But they won't have the operational understanding to make this deception work at the level it needs to work. And that means the rescue team might hit a compound where Crimson Shield is still at full strength and fully alert. That's how people die. The room was silent. Patterson's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. Finally, he looked at Harrison. "Colonel, your assessment." Harrison met the Admiral's eyes. "Sir, I think Commander Hale is right. The deception is the key to the whole operation. If it fails, we're asking a small rescue team to assault a defended position against superior numbers. The math doesn't work in our favor. Commander Hale gives us the best chance of making the deception work." Patterson was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then he nodded once sharply. "All right. Commander Hale coordinates from the ground with the diversionary element. But I want redundancy built into every phase of this operation. If anything starts going sideways, you pull out. We're not trading American lives for American lives." "Clear, clear, sir," Victoria said. "You have 48 hours to prep and execute," Patterson continued. "After that, the political window closes and we're back to hopping for a diplomatic solution that we all know isn't coming. Get our people home, Commander." "Yes, sir." The next 48 hours blurred into a continuous cycle of planning, briefing, equipment checks, and rehearsals. Victoria assembled her diversionary Team 4 Marine Force recon operators who'd volunteered when they heard the mission brief, each of them experienced in direct action and skilled enough to make a small force look like a much larger one. Their team leader was a gunnery sergeant named Marcus Webb, a compact man from Louisiana with 20 years in the Corps and eyes that had seen too much combat to be impressed by rank alone. He'd looked at Victoria with frank skepticism during their first meeting, not because she was a woman, but because he needed to know if she could actually do what the mission required. Victoria had spent 2 hours walking him through the operational plan, answering his questions about fire support coordination, extraction protocols, and contingencies. By the end of that conversation, Webb's skepticism had shifted into something that looked like cautious respect. "Ma'am, I've worked with plenty of coordinators who could talk a good game in the TOC but couldn't hack it when rounds started flying. You really think you can manage close air support and ground maneuver while people are shooting at you?" "Gunny, I've done it in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and places that aren't on any official deployment record," Victoria had replied. "I don't think I can do it, I know I can." Webb had studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "All right then, but when we're in it, I need you to trust me on ground tactics. You run the air and fire support, I'll run my Marines. We stay in our lanes, we'll be fine." "Agreed," Victoria had said, and they'd shaken on it. The rescue team was being assembled simultaneously, a joint unit of Marine Force Recon and Navy SEALs, who would be responsible for the actual extraction of the hostages. Their commander was a SEAL lieutenant named David Rourke, a serious man from Colorado who'd spent most of his career in counterterrorism operations. Rourke and Victoria had worked together once before, on an operation in Yemen that had gone sideways fast and required improvised extraction under fire. He'd seen her work under pressure and trusted her judgment. The coordination between the two teams, the diversionary element and the rescue element, was critical and complex. They would be operating miles apart with no direct line of sight, relying entirely on radio communication and precise timing. If the diversion started too early, Crimson Shield might have time to reposition before the rescue team arrived. If it started too late, the rescue team would be exposed during their insertion. Victoria spent hours building the timeline, adjusting it, refining it until the margin of error was measured in seconds rather than minutes. On the second day of preparation, Victoria was in a hangar at Miramar conducting final coordination with the helicopter crews who would be supporting both elements of the operation. The pilots were a mix of Marine and Navy aviators, all of them experienced in combat operations, but none of them familiar with Victoria's specific methods for coordinating close air support. She'd spent the morning walking them through her procedures, explaining how she'd call targets, how she'd adjust fire, what to listen for in her voice that would indicate she was under pressure and needed immediate support. One of the Marine pilots, a captain named Rodriguez, had raised a hand during the briefing. "Ma'am, no disrespect intended, but I've been flying combat support for 8 years and I've worked with a lot of ground coordinators. Everyone has their own style. What makes yours different?" Victoria had looked at him for a moment, deciding how much to explain. "Captain Rodriguez, most coordinators you've worked with are managing fire support from a position of relative safety, a fortified position, a vehicle, a location where they can focus primarily on coordination rather than survival. I'll be coordinating while moving under fire with a small team that's deliberately trying to draw enemy attention. That means my radio calls are going to be shorter, faster, and I'm going to assume you understand tactical context without me explaining everything in detail." She'd pulled up a tactical map on the screen behind her. "When I say danger close, I mean rounds are landing within 50 meters of my position, not the standard 100 meters. When I tell you to abort a run, I need you to abort immediately without asking for clarification. And when I give you a target, I need you to trust that I'm giving you the right target even if it doesn't match what you're seeing from the air. Can you work with those parameters?" Rodriguez had glanced at the other pilots, then back at Victoria. "We can work with that, ma'am, but it requires a lot of trust." "Yes," Victoria had agreed. "It does, and I'm going to earn that trust right now by being completely honest with you about the risks. The operation we're running is deliberately designed to put my team in a dangerous position, so the rescue team has a better chance of success. There will be moments during this mission when I'm asking you to fly into hostile fire to support us. There will be moments when the situation looks bad and your instinct will be to pull back for your own safety. I need you to override that instinct and trust my assessment of what we can handle, because if you pull back when we need you, people die." The hangar had been silent. Rodriguez had looked at the other pilots, saw nods from several of them, and turned back to Victoria. "Ma'am, you give us clear directions and we'll fly wherever you need us to fly. You have my word on that." "Thank you, Captain," Victoria had said. "Now let's rehearse it until we can run this operation in our sleep." They'd spent the rest of the day running through simulated scenarios, different approaches, different enemy responses, different contingencies. By the time the sun set, the helicopter crews could anticipate Victoria's needs and respond to her directions with a precision that came from shared understanding rather than rigid procedures. Webb, watching from the side of the hangar, had pulled Victoria aside as the air crews were securing their birds for the night. "Ma'am, I've been in this business a long time, and I've seen a lot of people try to coordinate complex operations. Most of them either micromanage everything or they're too hands-off and things fall apart. You found a middle ground that actually works." Victoria had shrugged. "Gunny, it's not about finding a middle ground. It's about understanding what decisions need to be made at what level. The pilots know how to fly their aircraft better than I ever will. You know how to maneuver Marines better than I do. My job isn't to tell everyone how to do their jobs. It's to make sure everyone's job fits together into something that achieves the mission objective." Webb had nodded slowly. "That's what I thought you'd say. But ma'am, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." "Go ahead. Why are you doing this?" Webb's voice was quiet, serious. "You've got enough rank and enough reputation that you could coordinate this from safety. You could manage the whole thing from a TOC and nobody would question it. But you're choosing to put yourself on the ground with a small team in a position that's designed to draw fire. I need to understand why, because when we're in it, I need to know your head's in the right place." Victoria had looked at Webb for a long moment, measuring how much to share. Finally, she decided he deserved the truth. "Gunny, I've spent 15 years coordinating operations where I send other people into danger while I stay relatively safe. Every time I do that, every time I make a call that puts someone else at risk, I carry that weight. It doesn't matter that it's necessary or that it's my job, I still feel it. This operation is different. The diversionary element is the key to the whole thing, and it requires someone who understands not just tactics but operational psychology. I can do that better than anyone else available. So for once, instead of sending someone else into the dangerous position, I can take it myself." Webb had been quiet for several seconds, processing that. "Ma'am, that's not a great reason. That sounds like someone carrying too much guilt and looking for a way to balance the scales." "Maybe," Victoria had admitted, "but it doesn't change the fact that I'm the best person for this job, and those 3 Marines who are being held by Crimson Shield deserve the best chance we can give them. If that means I'm the one taking the risk instead of someone else, I'm okay with that." Webb had studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. "All right, ma'am, I can work with that. But when we're out there, you follow my lead on ground tactics. You might be comfortable with guilt, but I'm not comfortable with getting my coordinator killed because she wanted to prove a point." "Fair enough, Gunny," Victoria had said. "I'll stay behind you and let you make the calls on movement and positioning. But fire support coordination is mine, and I need you to trust my judgment on that even when it seems aggressive." "Deal," Webb had said, and they'd shaken on it again. The final night before the operation, Victoria found herself alone in a small room at the operations center, going through her equipment one last time. Body armor, helmet, radio system, GPS, night vision, medical kit, ammunition, everything had to be perfect because there wouldn't be second chances once they were on the ground. She was checking the battery levels on her backup radio when there was a knock at the door. "Come in," she called without looking up. Captain Brennan entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one down on the desk beside Victoria's equipment and took a seat. "Thought you might need this. You've been going non-stop for 48 hours. Victoria accepted the coffee gratefully. "Thanks, Captain. Couldn't sleep anyway, too much mission planning running through my head." Brennan nodded. "I've read the final operational order. It's solid work, Commander. If this goes according to plan, it'll be taught in staff colleges as an example of successful deception operations. And if it doesn't go according to plan, it'll be taught as an example of what not to do," Victoria said with a faint smile. "That's how it works." "You nervous?" Brennan asked. Victoria considered the question seriously. "No, nervous would suggest uncertainty about the plan or the people executing it. I'm confident in the plan and I trust the teams. What I am is aware. Aware that we're running an operation with a lot of moving parts against a professional enemy who's good at what they do. Aware that despite all our planning and preparation, something could go wrong. But awareness isn't the same as nervousness." Brennan took a sip of his coffee. "I spoke to Admiral Patterson earlier. He wanted me to give you a message, that if at any point during the operation you feel the risk to the diversionary element is becoming unacceptable, you have his authorization to abort and extract. The mission is important, but it's not worth trading lives in a way that doesn't make tactical sense." "Understood," Victoria said. "But the Admiral should know that I'm not going into this with the intention of taking unnecessary risks. Everything we're doing is calculated, measured, and designed to maximize the chance of mission success while minimizing casualties. If I have to abort, it'll be because the tactical situation has changed in ways we didn't anticipate, not because I'm being reckless." Brennan nodded. "I figured that's what you'd say, but he wanted it said anyway." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, drinking coffee while Victoria continued her equipment checks. Finally, Brennan spoke again. "Can I ask you something personal, Commander?" "You can ask. I might not answer, but you can ask." "Why'd you join the Navy? With your skills and intelligence, you could have done anything. Why choose this life?" Victoria set down the radio battery she'd been testing and leaned back in her chair, looking at something beyond the walls of the small room. "My father was Navy. Submarine service spent most of my childhood deployed somewhere under the ocean I couldn't know about. When he was home, he'd tell me stories, not about the classified stuff, but about the people he served with. The teamwork, the precision, the way everyone had to trust each other completely because mistakes at depth could kill everyone aboard. I was fascinated by that level of trust and interdependence. She paused, gathering her thoughts. When I was 16, my father's boat had a serious casualty during a deployment. Hydraulic line rupture, fire in the engineering spaces, all the nightmare scenarios you train for. The crew controlled the damage, fought the fire, brought the boat to the surface safely. My father came home from that deployment different, not damaged, but changed. More aware of what mattered. He told me that in that moment when everything was going wrong, it wasn't individual heroics that saved them. It was every person doing their job perfectly while trusting that everyone else was doing theirs. That's when I knew I wanted to be part of something like that. "So you joined the Navy to follow in your father's footsteps?" Brennan asked. Victoria shook her head. "No, I joined the Navy to understand what he understood, that there's something profound about being part of a team where failure isn't just personal, it's collective. Where trust isn't optional, it's the only thing keeping everyone alive. I wanted to experience that and contribute to it." She looked at Brennan directly. "And I wanted to prove that someone like me, a woman in a profession that wasn't exactly welcoming to women when I started, could earn that trust and be worthy of it. Not by being better than everyone else, but by being good enough and reliable enough that my teammates could count on me the same way they'd count on anyone else." Brennan nodded slowly. "And have you proven that?" "The people I've served with seem to think so," Victoria said. "Webb and his Marines are willing to go into a hot zone with me coordinating. Rourke and the rescue team are betting their lives that I can keep Crimson Shield's attention on the eastern approach long enough for them to extract the hostages. That's not the kind of trust people give lightly. So yeah, I think I've proven it, at least to the people who matter." "Fair enough," Brennan said. He finished his coffee and stood. "I'll let you get back to your prep. The Hellos start spinning up at 0300. Try to get at least a couple hours of rest before then." "I'll try," Victoria said, though they both knew she wouldn't. After Brennan left, Victoria returned to her equipment checks, methodically going through every item until she was satisfied that everything was in perfect working order. Then she sat down and wrote 3 letters, one to her father, one to a sister she rarely saw, and one to the admiral commanding Naval Special Warfare Command. She sealed them in separate envelopes and left them on the desk with instructions they were only to be delivered if she didn't return from the operation. It was a ritual she'd performed before every high-risk mission for the past 15 years, a way of ensuring her thoughts and feelings were recorded even if she wasn't around to share them. At 0230, she gathered her gear and headed to the flight line where the helicopters were being prepared. The night was clear and cold, stars visible overhead in a way they never were in the cities she'd lived in. Webb and his Marines were already there, conducting their own final checks with the quiet efficiency of professionals who'd done this many times before. Webb looked up as Victoria approached, taking in her full combat loadout with an appraising eye. "Looking tactical, ma'am. You ready for this?" "As ready as I'm going to be, Gunny," Victoria replied. "Your Marine's good to go." "Always," Webb said. "We've run this scenario enough times that we could do it hungover and half asleep. Not that we would, but we could." Victoria allowed herself a brief smile. "Good to know. Let's make sure we don't have to test that theory." At 0300 exactly, the helicopters lifted off into the night sky, their rotors beating the air with a rhythmic thudding that Victoria had heard in so many different countries, on so many different missions. She was in the lead bird with Webb and 2 of his Marines, sitting in the jump seat with her radio system active, and her helmet's heads-up display showing the positions of all friendly units. The flight to the insert point took 40 minutes, flying nap of the Earth over terrain that looked alien and hostile in the green-tinted view of her night vision. They were heading into a country that officially had no American military presence, to conduct an operation that would be denied by everyone involved if it went wrong. The helicopter pilots flew with precision born of countless hours of training, threading through valleys and over ridges with a confidence that was beautiful to watch. Victoria monitored multiple radio nets simultaneously. The flight net where the pilots coordinated, the ground net where Webb communicated with his Marines, and the fire support net where she'd be calling in airstrikes if needed. At 0340, the pilot's voice came through her headset. 2 minutes to insert point. Everyone get ready. Victoria felt the familiar tightening in her gut that came before every combat operation, not fear exactly, but a kind of focused intensity that sharpened her awareness and slowed time. She checked her weapon one more time, confirmed her radio was transmitting on all nets, and looked at Webb. He gave her a thumbs up, his face invisible behind his night vision but his body language radiating calm competence. The helicopter flared, hovering 6 feet off the ground in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees. Webb's Marines moved first, fast-droping down with practiced speed, hitting the ground and immediately establishing a security perimeter. Victoria went next, sliding down the rope with her weapon slung and her hands burning slightly through her gloves despite the Nomex material. She hit the ground, moved clear, and the helicopter was already climbing away, its sound receding quickly into the night. Silence settled over the clearing, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the quiet sounds of the Marines checking their positions. Victoria activated her GPS and confirmed their location, exactly where they were supposed to be, 2 miles east of the target compound. Perfect insertion. Webb moved to her position, his voice a whisper through the radio. "Ma'am, we're set. Route to the observation point is clear according to the drone feed. Recommend we move now while we still have darkness." "Agreed, Gunny," Victoria whispered back. "Take us in. I'll be right behind you." They moved through the forest like ghosts, using night vision and careful placement of each step to avoid making noise. The Marines had done this enough times that they could navigate rough terrain in complete darkness without breaking formation or losing situational awareness. Victoria kept pace, her attention divided between watching where she was going and monitoring the radio nets for any indication that Crimson Shield had detected their insertion. After 30 minutes of careful movement, Webb held up a fist, signaling halt. They'd reached the observation point, a rocky outcropping that overlooked the target compound from about 800 meters away. Victoria moved up beside Webb and used her night vision to study the compound below. Looked exactly like the satellite imagery, a collection of buildings surrounded by a perimeter fence, with guard towers at 2 corners and the vehicles they'd identified parked in what looked like a motor pool. Lights were visible in several buildings, and she could see guards moving on patrol routes that seemed professional and well-organized. "Crimson Shield's awake and alert," Webb murmured. "They're not taking any chances." "Good," Victoria said. "That means they'll respond aggressively when we start the probe. Gives us a better chance of drawing their full attention." She checked her watch 0415. The rescue team should be beginning their insert phase now, flying through the northern valley toward their own staging position. Everything was on schedule. Victoria keyed her radio to the command net. "Actual, this is Overwatch 1. We're in position at the eastern observation point. Target compound is visible and appears to match intelligence reports. Recommend we begin diversionary operations on schedule at 0500. There was a brief pause, then Admiral Patterson's voice came back, transmitted from the Tactical Operations Center 50 miles away. "Overwatch 1, actual copies. You are cleared to begin diversionary operations at 0500. Rescue element reports they're on schedule for northern insert. Execute as planned and stay safe." "Overwatch 1 copies," Victoria said. "Beginning final preparation now." She switched to the fire support net and began coordinating with the attack helicopters that were orbiting 15 miles away, waiting for her call. "Sabre 1, this is Overwatch 1. Radio check, how copy?" "Overwatch 1, Sabre 1 reads you Lima Charlie," came the response from Captain Rodriguez. "We're holding at the designated orbit point with full ordnance load. Ready to support on your command." "Sabre 1, Overwatch 1 copies. Stand by for tasking at 0500. Initial targets will be the guard towers at grid coordinates I'm sending now." She transmitted the coordinates digitally through the radio system, then continued. Engagement will be danger close to my position. I need precision fires on the towers, then shift to the motor pool vehicles on my command. We're trying to create the impression of a major assault from this direction, so I need you to be aggressive but controlled. Can you work with that? Overwatch 1, Saber 1 understands. Danger close fires on guard towers, then shift to motor pool vehicles on your command. We'll make it look good for you. Rodriguez's voice carried a note of grim humor. Victoria allowed herself a brief smile. Saber 1, I'm counting on it. Stand by. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Victoria used the time to study the compound through her scope, identifying key terrain features, escape routes, and potential positions where Crimson Shield might establish counterfire positions. She marked each on her digital map and shared them with the attack helicopter crews so they'd have the same picture she did. At 0455, Webb moved close to her position. Ma'am, my Marines are set. We're ready to start putting rounds downrange when you give the word. Just remember, once we start shooting, Crimson Shield's going to respond hard and fast. We'll need that air support quickly. You'll have it, Gunny, Victoria assured him. Rodriguez and his crews are good. They'll be on target within 30 seconds of my call. All right then, Webb said. Let's wake these bastards up. At exactly 0500, Victoria keyed the fire support net. Saber 1, Overwatch 1. Execute, execute, execute on designated targets. 30 seconds later, the night erupted with the sound of rockets and cannon fire as the attack helicopters swept in from the east, their weapons lighting up the darkness with streams of tracer fire that looked like deadly fireworks. The guard towers on the eastern side of the compound exploded, the structures collapsing in flames as the rockets found their targets with precision. Before the echoes of the first strikes had faded, Webb's Marines opened fire with their rifles, aiming at lights in the compound and at any personnel who appeared in the open. The sound of gunfire rolled across the valley, and Victoria watched through her scope as Crimson Shield forces began responding exactly as she'd predicted. Lights in the compound went dark as defenders killed the illumination to make targeting harder. She could see armed figures running toward the eastern perimeter, taking up positions behind barriers and in prepared fighting positions. Vehicle engines roared to life in the motor pool, and the technical trucks began moving toward the eastern side of the compound. They're taking the bait, Webb said, satisfaction in his voice. Look at them commit forces to this side. Victoria was already adjusting her fire plan. Saber 1, Overwatch 1. Target the motor pool vehicles now before they can fully deploy. I'm marking targets with laser designation. She aimed her laser designator at the lead technical truck, painting it with an invisible beam that the attack helicopter's sensors would pick up. Seconds later, a Hellfire missile streaked out of the darkness and slammed into the truck, transforming it into a fireball that lit up the entire compound. The Marines cheered quietly at the successful strike, but Victoria was already moving to the next target, her mind processing tactical information faster than conscious thought. She could see Crimson Shield forces establishing a defensive line on the eastern perimeter, at least 15 fighters taking up positions with heavy weapons. More were coming from the buildings on the western side of the compound, exactly as she'd hoped. Every fighter moving east was one less fighter who'd be available to respond when the rescue team hit from the north. Gunny, they're setting up heavy weapons at grid 473921, Victoria called out. Can your Marines suppress that position? On it, ma'am, Webb responded. He directed 2 of his Marines to shift their fire, and moments later accurate rifle fire began impacting around the heavy weapons position, forcing the Crimson Shield fighters to keep their heads down. Victoria continued coordinating the airstrikes with methodical precision, directing the attack helicopters to hit targets in a sequence designed to maintain the illusion that this was the main assault. She'd strike a position, force Crimson Shield to respond, then hit another position before they could consolidate. It was a deadly dance of action and reaction, and she was leading every step. Through it all, she maintained awareness of the rescue team's progress through the northern valley. Their radio calls were clipped and professional, indicating they were on schedule and undetected. 5 minutes after the diversionary assault began, Victoria heard the call she'd been waiting for. Overwatch 1, Rescue 1. We're 2 minutes from insert point. Northern approach appears clear. Recommend you increase tempo of eastern engagement to ensure full enemy attention. Victoria keyed her radio immediately. Rescue 1, Overwatch 1 copies, increasing engagement tempo now. She switched to the fire support net. Saber 1, I need you to make a gun run on the eastern perimeter, danger close to those defensive positions. Make it loud, make it aggressive, make them think we're about to push through with ground forces. There was a brief pause, then Rodriguez responded. Overwatch 1, Saber 1 copies, coming in hot on the eastern perimeter. You might want to get your head down for this one. Victoria ducked behind the rocky outcropping as one of the attack helicopters roared in from the east, its 30mm cannon firing a continuous stream of high-explosive rounds that tore apart the Crimson Shield defensive positions. The noise was incredible, a thunderous hammering that echoed off the valley walls and made the ground shake. Through her scope, Victoria watched Crimson Shield forces react exactly as she'd hoped. They went aground, called for reinforcements, and shifted even more fighters to the eastern perimeter to counter what appeared to be an imminent ground assault. "Ma'am, we've got their full attention," Webb said. "Every gun they have is pointed this direction." Victoria checked her watch 0513. The rescue team should be inserting now. She keyed the command net. Actual, Overwatch 1, diversion is fully effective. Enemy has committed majority of forces to eastern perimeter. Rescue element should have clear run to target building. Overwatch 1, actual copies. Patterson's voice came back. Rescue element confirms they're on the ground and moving to target. Continue to hold enemy attention for another 6 minutes. Overwatch 1 copies 6 minutes, Victoria acknowledged, then immediately began planning the next phase of the engagement. 6 minutes was both an eternity and no time at all in combat. She needed to keep Crimson Shield focused on the eastern threat without allowing them time to think clearly or send scouts to investigate other approaches. She also needed to keep her Marines safe, because trading lives for deception would be a Pyrrhic victory at best. Saber 1, Overwatch 1. I need sustained harassment fire on the compound, focusing on the eastern and southern sectors. Mix up your targets, keep them reacting. Don't give them time to establish a coherent defense. Overwatch 1, Saber 1 copies, beginning sustained operations now. For the next 5 minutes, the night was filled with the sound of war helicopter cannons, rocket strikes, rifle fire, and the occasional explosion as Crimson Shield's ammunition or fuel stores took hits. Victoria orchestrated it all with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony, each element timed and directed to create maximum psychological impact while minimizing actual risk to her Marines. At 0519, the radio crackled with the call Victoria had been waiting for. Overwatch 1, Rescue 1. We have the packages. I say again, we have the packages. All 3 are alive and mobile. Beginning extraction now. Relief flooded through Victoria, though she kept her voice calm and professional. Rescue 1, Overwatch 1 copies. You have the packages. Well done. Saber 1, shift fire to create a withdrawal corridor for rescue element. I'm sending coordinates now. She transmitted the new fire plan, directing the attack helicopters to create a wall of fire and smoke between the rescue team's extraction route and the main Crimson Shield force. Then she keyed the net to Webb. Gunny, it's time for us to start falling back. Let's do it slow and controlled. We want Crimson Shield to think we're withdrawing under pressure, not that we've accomplished our mission. Webb acknowledged and began directing his Marines to withdraw in stages, always keeping at least 2 rifles pointed at the compound while the others moved. It was textbook tactical withdrawal, executed with a professionalism that made Victoria proud to be working with them. But Crimson Shield wasn't giving up easily. As they began to realize the eastern assault was faltering, some of their forces started maneuvering to flank Victoria's position. She spotted them through her Scope 6 fighters moving through the tree line to the south, trying to get around behind the Marines' position. Saber 1, Overwatch 1. I have 6 hostiles attempting to flank my position from the south, moving through the tree line at grid 474926. Can you interdict? Overwatch 1. Saber 1 has visual on your targets. Engaging now. The attack helicopter's cannon fire lit up the southern tree line, forcing the Crimson Shield flanking element to go to ground. It wouldn't stop them for long, but it gave Victoria's team time to continue their withdrawal. They'd moved about 200 meters from their original observation point when Victoria heard something that made her blood run cold, the distinctive whistling sound of incoming mortar fire. "Incoming!" she shouted, diving behind a fallen log as 3 mortar rounds impacted around their position. The explosions were close enough that she felt the concussion through her body armor and dirt rain down on her helmet. Webb's voice came through the radio, strained but controlled. "Everyone sound off. Anyone hit?" the Marines reported in shaken but uninjured. The mortar fire had been close but not quite accurate enough. Still, it meant Crimson Shield had their range and was adjusting. The next salvo would be more dangerous. "Ma'am, we need to move now," Webb said urgently. "They'll walk those mortars right onto our position if we stay here." Victoria was already coordinating. "Saber 1, I need immediate suppression fire on the mortar position. I'm estimating location based on trajectory and flight time sending coordinates now." She did the mental math quickly, calculating where the mortar team had to be based on the angle and timing of the incoming rounds, and transmitted the estimated position to the attack helicopters. Rodriguez responded instantly. "Overwatch 1, Saber 1 is engaging estimated mortar position now. Keep your heads down." The attack helicopter swept over the compound, its rockets impacting in the area Victoria had identified. She couldn't confirm if they'd actually destroyed the mortar position, but the incoming fire stopped, which was good enough. "Gunny, get your Marines moving to the secondary extraction point," Victoria ordered. "I'll coordinate our ride and keep the air support active." Webb didn't argue. He got his Marines up and moving, using terrain and darkness to mask their withdrawal, while Victoria stayed behind the fallen log, her radio active on multiple nets, as she managed the controlled chaos of the extraction. She could hear the rescue team's radio calls as they reached their extraction helicopters with the 3 freed hostages. Their operation had been successful. Now Victoria just needed to make sure her own team got out safely. The next 10 minutes were a blur of movement and fire support coordination. Victoria directed the attack helicopters to create a screen of fire between her team and the Crimson Shield forces, buying time for the Marines to reach the secondary extraction point. She could hear enemy forces moving through the forest behind them, pursuing but staying cautious because they didn't know how many Americans they were actually facing. Finally, blessedly, she heard the sound of helicopter rotors approaching their extraction birds, coming in fast and low to pick them up. Victoria was the last one to reach the extraction point, sprinting the final 100 meters while Webb's Marines provided covering fire. She dove into the helicopter just as it was lifting off, hands grabbing her gear and hauling her fully inside before the bird was clear of the trees. "Everyone accounted for," Webb shouted over the rotor noise. "Everyone's here, Gunny." One of the Marines shouted back. Victoria allowed herself to breathe, really breathe, for the first time in 20 minutes. They'd done it. The diversion had worked. The rescue team had retrieved the hostages, and everyone was coming home. The helicopter flight back to base was subdued, everyone processing what they'd just been through. Victoria sat with her helmet off, her hair matted with sweat, and monitored the radio nets to track the rescue team's progress. They were clear of the area and heading for a secure location where the freed hostages could receive medical attention. It was only when the helicopters touched down at the forward operating base that Victoria allowed herself to feel the full weight of exhaustion. She climbed out of the bird on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and was immediately met by Captain Brennan and Admiral Patterson. Patterson looked her up and down, taking in her dirt-covered uniform and the minor cuts on her face from flying debris during the mortar attack. "Commander Hale, good work. The rescue team reports all 3 hostages are in good condition. Your diversion worked exactly as planned." "Thank you, sir," Victoria said. "It was a team effort. Gunny Webb and his Marines performed flawlessly, and the air crews were exceptional. Patterson nodded, then surprised her by extending his hand. "I'll be honest, Commander. I had doubts about putting you on the ground with the diversionary element. I thought it was an unnecessary risk. But you were right. The operation needed someone with your experience and judgment in that position. Well done." Victoria shook his hand, too tired to feel vindicated or proud, just grateful that everyone had made it home. "Sir, if it's all the same to you, I'd like to check on the freed hostages before I file my after-action report." "Of course," Patterson said. "They're in the medical tent. The docs say they're dehydrated and have some minor injuries, but nothing life-threatening. They're asking to meet the team that got them out." Victoria walked to the medical tent with Webb beside her. The freed Marines were sitting on cots, being attended to by Navy corpsmen, their faces showing the strain of their captivity but their eyes alert and aware. When Victoria entered, all three of them tried to stand at attention. "As you were," Victoria said quickly. "Stay seated. You've been through enough without standing on ceremony." The senior of the three, a staff sergeant named Miller, looked at her with something like awe. "Ma'am, are you the one who coordinated the rescue?" "I coordinated the diversionary element that kept Crimson Shield's attention on the wrong side of the compound," Victoria replied. "The actual rescue was executed by a joint SEAL and Force Recon team. They're the ones who came through the door for you." Miller shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, we could hear the firefight on the eastern side. It sounded like a major assault, artillery and airstrikes and everything. The guards were completely focused on that direction. We didn't even know the rescue team was coming until they were breaching our door. That diversion saved our lives." Victoria felt Webb's hand on her shoulder, a gesture of respect and camaraderie. "Staff Sergeant, I'm just glad you're safe. That's all that matters." She spent a few more minutes with the freed Marines, answering their questions about the operation and accepting their gratitude with the same quiet grace she'd shown throughout the mission. Then she left them to their medical care and went to file her after-action report. By the time she finished the paperwork, the sun was rising over the base, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossibly beautiful after the darkness of the operation. Victoria stood outside the operations center, coffee in hand, and watched the dawn break. "Commander Hale." She turned to find Lance Corporal Morrison standing a respectful distance away, his uniform crisp and his posture uncertain. "Yes, Lance Corporal." Morrison came to attention. "Ma'am, I heard about the operation. What you did out there, coordinating under fire and bringing everyone home safe. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for how I treated you when you first arrived. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made, and I'm working on being better at that." Victoria studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Lance Corporal Morrison, do you know what the most important lesson is from last night's operation?" Morrison hesitated. "Ma'am, I'm not sure." "The lesson," Victoria said quietly, "is that effectiveness isn't about appearances or assumptions. It's about competence, preparation, and the willingness to do what needs to be done regardless of what others think. You made an assumption about me based on what you saw. What matters now isn't that you were wrong, but what you do with that knowledge going forward." He paused, then added, "The fact that you came here to apologize tells me you're already applying that lesson. That's good, Morrison. That's how you grow into a better Marine." Morrison's face showed relief and something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am. I won't forget that." Victoria watched him walk away, then turned back to the sunrise. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear helicopters taking off for morning patrols, the same sound that had marked so many mornings in so many different countries. The operation was over, the hostages were safe, and everyone had come home. For Victoria Hale, that was enough. It was always enough. But as she stood there in the growing light, she knew this mission would become another story that circulated through the military community about the quiet woman in civilian clothes who'd coordinated a rescue operation from the most dangerous position, who'd put herself in harm's way so others could come home safely. Some would hear it and dismiss her as reckless. Others would understand what she'd understood all along, that leadership sometimes meant taking the hard position yourself instead of asking others to take it. That real authority came not from rank or gender or assumptions, but from competence demonstrated under pressure. And somewhere, in another operations center in another country, another young service member would hear the story of Commander Victoria Hale and learn the same lesson Morrison had learned. That you should never underestimate someone based on appearances. That the most dangerous person in the room is often the one nobody notices until it's too late. That quiet competence beats loud confidence every single time. Victoria finished her coffee, tossed the empty cup in a trash can, and headed to her quarters for a few hours of sleep. She had another mission briefing in the afternoon, another operation to plan, another chance to prove that the measure of a person wasn't in how they looked but in what they could do when it mattered most. And she'd keep proving it, mission after mission, until the day came when she didn't have to prove it anymore. Until competence was accepted on its own merits, regardless of who demonstrated it. Until the question wasn't, do you know who I am? But simply, can you do the job? That day hadn't arrived yet, but Victoria Hale would keep working toward it, one successful mission at a time, in the quiet and professional way that had always been her signature. Because that's what leaders do. They show the way forward, not with words but with actions. And Victoria's actions had spoken louder than any words ever could.